Good, yeah, so I was, I don't know if I said that or not. So gustation is the final discriminator. Did I say that out loud? Y'all shut up. This class is starting.
We're talking about the class.
What?
We're talking about the class.
Wait until I'm sorry. You've had all morning to talk about this class. Okay, so did I say that out loud or did I just show it?
What'd you say?
You should. I thought you said, I think you should shove it. That's rude. Okay, so the basic idea is that, so you've got olfaction, which are kind of long range identifiers of prey, and you've got vomerofaction, which tend to be shorter term, mostly because they're responding to heavier chemicals that are on the ground, right? So these organisms are going to pick up chemical cues that have been left behind, and then gustation happens when the animal ingests it. So you've got some animals that have taste buds in the lining of their mouth, and if it doesn't match up with the appropriate prey signal, then they'll reject it. Did you have a question?
Yeah, what does the HMW stand for the vomerofaction?
High molecular weight. So heavy stuff that settles. Okay, and so I watched an example of this, not in amphibians and reptiles, but in fish. So I've got some fish in the aquarium, and I feed them flake food, which is not a typical aspect of their diet, but they can smell it. So chemosensory mechanisms are kicking in, and they'll ingest it. But when they ingest it, it doesn't feel right, and so they spit it out because it's not prey. It's not living prey. So it takes them a while to get adjusted to that. And eventually, some of them realize it's food, and some of them don't, and they just continually spit it out until they ultimately starve to death because they're not eating the right stuff. Or you feed them something different. So, but amphibians and reptiles will do the same thing. Yeah. So anyway, so that's gustation. Okay. So chemosensory capabilities include basically olfaction, vomerofaction, and gustation. Those are the three main forms of chemosensory prey detection. So moving on to the other. Or just in general, their capabilities. So mostly for salamanders, olfaction and vomerofaction are pretty important in terms of identifying prey. But most of them also rely heavily on vision. Right? So they tend to be important for salamanders particularly, but vision is also one of the main stimuli that they use for finding prey. For anurans, it's mostly olfaction. Right, so and vision. So they can smell, but they don't use vomerofaction very much. And so mostly olfaction and vision for anurans. For crocodiles, mostly visual and or tactile, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And so these animals are mostly finding food based on vision, and then they're using tactile senses to discriminate one thing from another. Doesn't seem to be right what I'm saying. It's not right what it didn't match up with what I was saying. Okay, no, this is just, I guess, a summary of what I was just talking about. So we're talking about chemosensory capabilities, and so some of them are pretty good at it, some of them not so much. For squamates, there are some groups of lizards, like the more, I guess, more ancestral types of lizards aren't particularly good at chemosensory capabilities. Olfaction is going to be important in most of them, but they're not real sophisticated. They don't use it heavily. Mostly they're using visuals. In visual cues. In others, obviously, is well developed, particularly the snakes, and a lot of the lizards have forked tongues and highly developed Jacobson's organ or vomeronasal organ, and they're using that significantly or exclusively under some conditions. And so in the squamates, it varies quite a bit whether chemosensory capabilities is important or not. So you've all seen pictures of snakes with their tongues out, and so what this animal is doing is picking up heavy molecules that are on the ground and then using the vomeronasal organ to interpret those signals, and if prey is part of that, they will search and follow it. The forked nature, of course, we discussed that earlier, gives a good directionality to the prey that these animals are searching for. So in some it's really important, in others it's a lot less important. Okay, so the next form of prey detection is tactile, which is the sense of touch, essentially. Mechanoreception is kind of the idea, so it's going to cause epithelial cells that typically have some type of hair-like projection, and that's connected to a nerve cell to transmit that physical contact between the organism and the central nervous system. So in some of these organisms, there's not a whole lot known about it, and probably it's not real important for a lot of them, and that's one of the reasons why it's not really heavily studied or understood. In others, it's been well documented, and they obviously use it to find prey. And some examples include for the crocodilians, they have mechanoreceptors in their skin, and not all of them use it like this, but in many cases, they're gonna use it at least some of the time for searching for particular types of prey. These guys, I don't know what type of crocodilian that is, but they are essentially sitting in the river with their mouths open, waiting for potential prey items to make contact with the mechanoreceptors in the mouth. And so once they touch that, then the mouth closes and they potentially have a prey item. Snakes will also do this, and kind of move around the environment with their mouths open, and when it's stimulated by touch, they'll close their mouth. So in some it's well developed, in others not so much. For the aquatic amphibians, they have mechanoreceptors in the form of the lateral line system. And so I don't know if we talked a whole lot about lateral line system, but the basic idea is the hair cells in these little chambers along this line, laterally placed on the animal. And so water sloshes around if there's a current, or if there's an animal that swims through the water, it pushes the water, and those mechanoreceptors are sensing the water movement, and that sends a signal to the brain. And so these animals, especially if there's something like a siren, they're aquatic, and the lateral line system works great in aquatic environments because water is not very compressible. So if you move the water here, it's going to move over there, and that moves the hair cells. It's really important for these guys because most of them live in environments that are dark or turbid, and so vision can't really be very heavily relied on because there's just not enough light in the environments that they typically inhabit. Chemosensory capabilities would be important, but this is going to be one of the main mechanisms that they use to find prey. For turtles, there are a few, as I mentioned before, something like the alligator snapping turtles in particular, which are classic sit and wait predators. They sit on the bottom of a river or a pond with their mouths open, and that structure in the tongue kind of wiggles around, and when that's touched, that is a mechanoreceptor, or stimulates the mechanoreceptor, and the mouth shuts, and hopefully there's a fish or another vertebrate or some other prey item in there. So for some turtles, it's pretty important. There's some others, like this one, the mata-mata, uses vacuum, vacuum-like feeding. So they expand the buccal cavity, and that brings in a lot of water. They lower the pressure of the mouth cavity, and then water flows in with whatever prey could possibly be there. And so these little cirri or fleshy extensions on the lower jaw are covered with mechanoreceptors. And so they're kind of slowly moving around the environment, and if a potential prey item touches that, then the mouth opens, and then hopefully that prey item, whatever stimulated it, is going to go into the mouth. And so for some, it's pretty important, obviously. There's that. For squamates, tactile prey detection, not real common. There are a few that display it, like this guy, the tentacled snake. And so this is another aquatic animal, and these protrusions on the front of the head are the tentacles, and of course they are covered with mechanoreceptors, and so they're again moving around in kind of a turbid environment, so light's not very available, and if they touch something that could be a potential prey, then they'll strike at it and try to capture that. Okay, so tactile prey detection is not super common among amphibians and reptiles, as you can see, but for some it's extremely important, right? And mostly it's for those organisms that are living in environments that are, other senses might be limited for one reason or another. So thermal detection of prey is fairly limited as well, but it's crucial to some organisms, reptiles in particular. So essentially what's happening is these animals have cells that are sensitive to infrared radiation. And so the difference between the air temperature and the organism doesn't have to be much for the thermal detecting sensory system to be stimulated. And so you can see as little as 0.05 degrees Celsius difference between the air temperature or the environmental temperature and the prey organism is all that's needed to send the signal to the brain in terms of predatory response. And so there's only a few organisms, like I said, that are known to be able to do this, particularly the boas and pythons. And so they have the heat-sensitive cells, epithelial cells, in scales and on the upper lip particularly. And so there's depressions in those scales, and at the base of those would be the sensory system, the infrared detectors. And so, of course, they're using that to locate prey that are giving off some amount of infrared radiation relative to the surrounding environment. And then, of course, the viperids or crotalids, so crotality, viperidae, both of those are pit vipers. And so those animals have the loreal pit, the heat-sensitive pit, or the heat-sensitive cells are in this pit on the loreal scale. That's why it's called the loreal pit. And that's on the front jaw, or the upper jaw between the nostril and the eye, a little bit lower than that line. So, but the same basic concept is true. Those at the base of that pit are the cells that are sensitive to infrared radiation. A lot of these animals are relying exclusively on thermal cues to capture prey, particularly. And it's most typical when we're talking about organisms that are feeding on endothermal organisms. Like, so a copperhead is going to feed on what mostly? What did you guess?
Mice.
Small mammals like mice, shrews, voles, those kinds of things. And it's most effective on endothermic organisms because they're always giving off quite a bit of heat, just because of their internal mechanism for maintaining homeostasis. And so these animals obviously can pick that up pretty easily. It's typical, for these animals to be quite good at it when they're targeting endothermic organisms. It can be effective on ectothermic organisms like other amphibians and reptiles, particularly because. Tell me what circumstances it would be effective on an ectothermic organism.
Cold environment, or losing body heat?
In a cooler environment, right? So that's part of it. But if you're talking about a cooler environment, then if you're an ectotherm, then what's your body temperature going to be? Kind of cool, right? So only under certain circumstances would that work, but we talked a little bit about this earlier in the semester when I said, ectothermics, you can't really say their body temperature is the same as the environmental temperature. How come? Well, use that with some other words around it, like in a sentence.
They still have certain ranges of temperatures that they need for their metabolisms to work.
Right, they have particular ranges that they're looking for, but if I say, okay, explain why it's difficult to say that this animal's body temperature is the same as the environmental temperature.
They're still producing some heat through their metabolic processes.
They are producing some heat, but it may not be noticeable or measurable in a particular environment. I guess what I want you to focus on is the environmental temperature. Why is that hard to pinpoint? Or is it hard to pinpoint?
Depends on where you're at.
Depends on where you're at, right? So the environmental temperature is highly variable on any given day at any given moment. Depends on where you are, right? So if you're an organism that's feeding on ectothermic organisms, sometimes their body temperatures are quite high, right? But you have to be in a position where your body temperature is a little bit lower, or the environmental temperature is lower than the body temperature of the other organism we're talking about. So this could be an example, right? So here's a rattlesnake kind of curled up under a log in the shade, right? So the microclimate under that log is kind of cool, But if this lizard that has been out in the open, his body temperature is way up there, now he said, okay, I gotta get out of out of the sun because my body temperature is outside my range. I'm gonna go in the shade, and there sits this rattlesnake whose body temperature is similar to the shade, and the environmental temperature is, if affected by the shade, that lizard's gonna have a really high body temperature relative to that surrounding, and so they can easily pick up the cues on that. So for these animals, even though we're mostly talking about feeding on endotherms, because their body temperature is always gonna be pretty high, and so most of the time it's gonna be a little bit higher than the microclimate that these organisms are sitting in. Sometimes it can work with other organisms depending on the circumstances, the thermal biology of that animal at the moment. Other animals like a cottonmouth, for example, they're not as, I don't know, they're probably just as good at it, but they don't use it as much, right? Because they're feeding on mostly what are the cottonmouths feeding on? Mostly fish, right? So the cottonmouth's in the water, the fish is in the water. If the fish and the cottonmouth are both ectotherms, and their body temperatures are gonna be highly influenced by the temperature of the water, so there's not really a big difference there. So they're gonna use other cues, vision, chemosensory capabilities, and also, depending on the circumstances, their infrared detection system that they have. Okay, so that's thermal detection of prey. So mostly amphibians and reptiles don't do that. There are a few that can. Auditory prey detection, of course, is through the process of hearing, which is similar to mechanoreception that we talked about before. Different in that we're talking specifically about mechanoreception in the inner ear. So in terms of auditory, in other words, you hear the prey item and then you go after it. It's not used very often in amphibians and reptiles in terms of prey detection, right? So when I say airborne sound, like instead of being in the water, right? So if you're in the water, you're using mechanoreceptors mostly through the lateral line system. That's the same thing as what happens in air, but the system that we use to detect it is a little bit different. So most of these animals don't really rely heavily on airborne sound. They can hear, right? So if we think about frogs, for example, that they can hear, and that's kind of obvious when you think about what's happening during mating season, right? The males are calling like crazy to attract females. So obviously they can hear each other, but they're not using it to find prey, typically. And so there are some that are known to do that. So cane toad is an example. So they're hearing prey move around, and then that stimulates predatory response in these guys. So we know those animals do it. There are some geckos that also use sound to locate prey. Not all of them do that. Most of them are visual predators, and you can see that there's a clue. Their eyes are huge, and they're nocturnal, and they're using eyesight, vision to identify prey for the most part. But some of them use sound. In several different types of amphibians and reptiles, they're using sound or seismic vibrations, which would be vibrations through the sediment or the soil. And so in that case, it can be particularly important. We talked a little bit earlier about some of the things that unite all the amphibians together. They all have the opercularis system of hearing. So the inner ear is kind of connected to the tympanum, which is connected to the forelimbs, which is in contact with the ground. And so as vibrations pass along the ground, they pass into the forelimb, pass into the inner ear. So they're using mechanoreception or auditory prey detection to feel or hear organisms that are moving around on the surface or burrowing through the soil. And so that's what's happening. So these animals can they're actually hearing through their limbs, because those vibrations are being transmitted into the inner ear, which is what we're talking about, auditory prey detection. Let's see, what else? So snakes also use kind of seismic vibrations, and so obviously one of the characteristics of snakes, if we think about the difference between snakes and lizards, is snakes don't have an outer ear, and they can't really hear airborne sounds very well, right? So if you find a snake and you whisper to it, they're probably not going to really respond to that because they can't hear very well that way. But they can feel and hear through seismic vibrations. And so, and those are different things, right? You can feel with your fingers, right? If I put my hand on the ground, you stomped on the floor, I could feel that, but I could also hear it. So there's different things happening at the same time. Snakes don't have an outer ear, but they can hear through vibrations, because the vibrations are kind of transmitted through the lower jaw, which they are typically in contact with the ground, and then ultimately those vibrations get passed on to the inner ear. So they're hearing in that way, but they are less sensitive to airborne sound. And so, of course, they're feeding on things that are moving around on the ground for the most part. Okay, does anybody have any questions on that? So those are the main idea of that last section there, was the different mechanisms that these animals use to identify prey, and then what happens at that point. So the next section I want to talk a little bit about in terms of foraging is the capture part, and then ingestion, because there's lots of different ways that amphibians and reptiles capture prey, and the energetics behind that. So there's a few different mechanisms. The most common way is just biting and holding, and so not very complicated system of prey capture and ingestion. So most of these animals are going to use something like that. So if you watch a lizard or a toad or something eat, mostly you're going to see that. You're going to see them just lunge, grab, and hold, and then swallow in some way. They don't really chew much. There are a few that crunch a little bit, but they don't have the masticating capabilities that other organisms have, because their jaws go up and down and not side to side. So they're going to smush it a little bit and ingest it, but really not a whole lot of handling involved in most amphibians and reptiles. And so the typical mechanism is go after it, grab it, and then you're going to mush it a little bit and then swallow it. But the one thing I do want to talk about, though, a little bit is in terms of what they eat has an influence on what the teeth morphology look like. Even though they can't chew, their teeth are very different, and so they might be used for crushing different types of prey, or they're going to be piercing, depending on what they do, or grabbing, and then the prey is typically swallowed mostly whole, or in little pieces. So if we look at their teeth morphology, we'll see that the herbivorous kinds of animals are going to have teeth structures that kind of grind or rip. Some of the large lizards and crocodiles will also pull chunks of pieces off of potential prey. And of course, that's not really related to the teeth morphology, but that their behavior is that. So mostly these animals are eating whole, but sometimes they'll eat pieces depending on the type of animal or organism that they're consuming. So the teeth is different depending on what they're doing. So if they typically feed on like mollusks or organisms that have a really tough exoskeleton, for example, like we're talking about insects, then the teeth tend to be kind of round, like ball-peen hammer shaped, or more flattened. So if you look at the caiman lizard, so here's the lizard, and here's the teeth morphology. So you can see that they're kind of round and flattened on the surface, and that's mostly for crushing hard mollusk shells like snails and things like that. And so that's pretty typical of these guys. They could be more blade-like, and so if you look at monitor lizards and things like that, their teeth are more like a piranha tooth, where they're kind of triangle, but they're sharp. And so, of course, the idea is that they're going to bite and just slice off a piece, because they're eating large mammalian prey species that eventually have died, and they're just going to kind of cut pieces off. So these guys have much different teeth morphology, and this is kind of what it looks like. They might have teeth shape that are different along the jaw, and so some of the organisms that specialize on eating mollusks, but just pulling the mollusk out, have different shaped teeth. And so the teeth on the lower jaw might be a little bit longer than on the upper jaw. So on this one, so the back teeth are pretty short, but the front teeth are really long, and they can use that to kind of reach in and pull a snail out. We have the Decay's brown snake also eats a lot of snails, and so if you look at their teeth morphology, it's variable across across the length of the jaw because it's designed to kind of reach in and pull out the snail from the shell. They don't crush the shell like the caiman lizards do, they just pull the snail out. They could have really long and curved teeth, like these emerald boas, and so it looks like a venomous snake. They're non-venomous, but they have really long front fangs on the front of the jaw, and they mostly feed on birds. And so, of course, if you're an animal like that, you can't just strike and then let go, or you can't strike and then constrict very easily because you're living in a tree, right? So that behavior is not going to work very well, because if you try to wrap around, then you're going to fall in the tree. So these guys just grab, and those teeth just kind of sink in and hold the bird, and then they just hold on to it until it dies, and then they eat it. So the different types of teeth kind of match up with the things that they eat sometimes, right? Most amphibians and reptiles eat what?
Invertebrates.
Insects, or if they're bigger, they eat mammals or
Other
whatever. What I was getting at is whatever they can get mostly, and, right? So most amphibians and reptiles are eating a whole variety of things, and so their teeth are going to be more generalized. They're not really specific on a particular type of thing. Some amphibians and reptiles are more specialized, and so their teeth kind of reflect that specialization. But generally speaking, their teeth are very similar and generalized teeth for holding and ingesting and getting down the hatch. Obviously, there's some more specialized types of prey capture that you probably know about already. Constriction is probably one of the main ones for the snakes particularly. And so the idea here is that they're going to grab and then squeeze, and that is going to ultimately subdue the prey. And so, how many people have ever seen a rat snake eat, or a king snake eat, or a python eat? Anybody raise your hand if you've ever seen that on TV or anything? Has anybody ever seen a snake constrict? Raise your hand if you've seen it. No, you got. Oh, okay, you got your. So everybody's seen it. So the idea is that these guys are going to grab the prey and then loop around it and then constrict, and that's what they're doing. They're squeezing the prey, but they're not crushing the prey. And so I guess that's the main point that I wanted to talk about here, is that they're holding the prey, they're tightening around the prey, but they're not crushing it. They're not causing damage to the internal organs when they do that. Essentially what they're doing is constricting so much that blood flow is stopped. And so if blood flow stops, then obviously the animal's not going to survive very long, especially if it's a mammalian species or an endothermic organism. Why is that true? Well, I mean, that would be true for a gar also, right? Gar also use oxygen, but it doesn't work as well on a gar. Or a salamander. Why would you expect constriction to be very effective if that's the result, right? The result is that they're squeezing it so tight that blood can't flow. Why is that going to be lethal to a mammal?
Because they can't
quicker.
breathe. Oh.
But that's the only way we can breathe is through our blood?
Well, that's the only way you can breathe. I mean, that's true for all animals, right? That's how they get oxygen to the cells. But mammals in particular, or birds too, if you stop the blood, they're going to die fast. If you're a frog, if you stop the bleeding, they might not die for a while. What's the difference?
That's the only way oxygen can get to any of their, like the brain or the heart or anything.
All those organisms need oxygen to the brain, the heart. Okay, maybe, what about?
Can you rephrase the question?
My question is this. That works very effectively on endothermic organisms. It works less effectively on ectothermic organisms. My question is why?
I don't know.
Metabolism.
What's that?
Metabolism.
Metabolism is why, right? So if you're an endothermic organism, you always have a huge demand for oxygen. And if you stop it for just a couple of seconds, that's it. You can't supply the metabolic demand of an organism that's always at high speed. If you're an ectothermic organism, low metabolism, it's gonna take a while for that to take effect, right? Because you don't have a big oxygen demand relative to an endothermic organism, so it doesn't have as, it doesn't affect the organism as quickly, yeah.
Would a lack of oxygen in the milling, right, is there a difference between like how much toxic is pulled up without being able to, like lactic acid if it was on it?
Oh, I'm sure there is, yeah. So all the things that happen metabolically happen much faster in an endotherm than they do in an ectotherm. So, you know, if you ever been fishing, I don't do this, but I know people do it. You catch a gar and you throw it up on the bank because they're trash fish, right? It's gonna stay alive on the bank for an hour and a half, but even though it still needs oxygen, but the metabolism is so low, the needs aren't requiring oxygen to be present all the time. And so that's, you know, the main difference is these animals are gonna constrict. It's gonna take effect quickly, and then they're gonna be able to ingest, if you're dealing with endothermic organisms. And so ultimately what's happening is these animals are squeezing, and then in response to what the prey does, they'll either tighten or they'll relax. And ultimately they're sensitive because they have mechanoreceptors in the skin that can tell them what's going on with the prey item. And so ultimately, you know, as the animal relaxes, they kind of tighten. So the animal exhales, and they're just kind of squeezing down. And eventually the blood flow to the heart is going to be stopped, and that ultimately causes the animal to die, what you would describe as shock, like extremely low blood pressure, because the blood's not flowing. And that's going to stop the supply of oxygen to the cells. Okay, let's see. Most of that's kind of what I said already, in that they'll maintain that just to make sure the organism is dead. And of course, the advantage of that, the reason why they do that is because obviously if you let go and the animal's still alive, they're gonna take off and you're gonna lose a meal. So they usually will relax, and if they, for a few minutes, and then if any movement is detected, then they'll tighten again just to make sure. So this is typical behavior for boas and pythons and colubrids like rat snake, king snake, corn snake, all those animals in the family, colubridae and some others. So, but these are the ones that most typically do constriction. So here's just an example of that, a rat snake. I'm not sure what he's got there, something or other, something good. It sometimes occurs in venomous snakes, and so not typically, but sometimes we used to have some venomous snakes in captivity in the biology department, and they would sometimes bite and constrict. Sometimes they'd bite and let go, sometimes they just bite and hold on, sometimes they would just bite and swallow. So it's pretty variable, but some of the venomous snakes do that, but mostly it's gonna be non-venomous animals, because the venomous snakes have another mechanism that they use to subdue their prey. Yeah.
Was that between like different individuals or just?
No,
different
same
species?
individual, but different. Same species might do a variety of things. As an individual, it might do different things. So there's some, like I said before, it typically involves endothermic animals like birds and mammals, just because it's so effective with those types of animals. There are some organisms that use constriction to capture fish. There aren't that many. Well, I guess the water snakes do. I've seen the water snakes do that too with fish. But this guy in particular, the file snake, is known to use constriction almost all the time. They're called file snakes because their skin is like bumpy and it's rough, and that helps them hold on to a slimy fish. But essentially what they're doing is they grab the fish and they'll wrap around the fish and they squeeze the head. Why is that important?
So they can stop
for
breathing.
ichthyology graduates.
Because of the gills.
What about them?
They can't open up and move.
The operculum can't, right? So these animals are using the flow of water across the gills, and that has to involve the sequential opening of the mouth and the opening of the operculum, and if the operculum can't open, then water's not flowing across the gills, and so ultimately that's gonna cause the same effect as it would if you cut the blood flow to an endotherm. So these animals are just kind of wrapping around the fish and just squeezing its head, and the rest of the body too, but that's not really having much of an effect. It just stops the breathing for the fish that they're ingesting. Okay, let's see what else. Okay, so another method, of course, is injecting venoms. And so there's a variety of reptiles. I don't know of any amphibians that use venom to subdue prey. There are probably some, now that I said that, but I don't know of any. But it evolved independently in a variety of lineages of reptiles. And so some examples, different families. So Helodromatidea are the Gila monsters and the beaded lizards. So those animals use venom to subdue prey. Here's a Gila monster and there's a beaded lizard. The elapids, which includes the cobras, kraits. We have the coral snake, not in Tennessee, but in North America. Coral snakes, those are all in the same family, Elapidae. Of course, they have venom delivery systems. And Viperidae, Crotalidae, these are the pit vipers. We have cottonmouth, copperhead, rattlesnakes. They all use injected venoms. Matricidae, which are the garter snakes. So these guys have mild venom, and they've got glands that produce venom that can affect certain organisms. Humans not really affected by it, although that there has been some documented cases of like irritation caused by the venom of garter snakes. And then Dipsadidae, for us that would be hognose snakes, and ringneck snakes also have a venom delivery system that's not really toxic to humans so much, but it is toxic to the prey that they consume. So some of the benefits of injecting venom would be what? What's the advantage of?
Doesn't require a lot of physical demand.
Well, what do you mean by physical demand?
Well, in terms of,
Like energetics?
like in terms of like constricting or holding your prey down instead of just, the only other demand would be.
The energetics of it, of the capture and ingestion are lower, but the production of venom is pretty expensive, right? So that requires some energy and expense. What are some other advantages of injecting venom?
They can't fight back.
Yeah, because if you're grabbing and wrapping around, you're like in close personal contact with a potential prey. That could be, a squirrel or a rat or something like that has teeth and claws and is willing to use them if you're gonna try to ingest them. And so they oftentimes get injured during that process. If you inject venom, then you inject and then you just kind of sit back and let it all happen. So the risk of injury is a lot less if you're injecting venom.
Is a prey item that has been injected with venom and it gets stolen by a different predator, would that predator then also be affected by the venom?
Probably not. Venom is, I don't know for sure, but the venom is something that it has to get into the bloodstream typically, and I don't know what happens if it's digested or
Because
broken
it's the
down.
difference
so.
between injected and
And
injected.
swallowed, yes.
I mean,
yes.
there's a guy in Florida that works with venomous snakes a lot. And every time he would get sprayed with venom, he would just take it and lick it because it wouldn't harm him.
I don't
Yeah.
know why you would do that, but, and so the short answer is probably it doesn't affect them the same way, because once you start to break it down, it's different, but there could potentially be some effects to that. So one benefit is that you're distant from the prey item, so the risk of injury is a lot lower. Another benefit is that the venom, in most cases, are digesting some biological molecule, right? And so there are enzymes that are breaking apart biological molecules, and so obviously that's going to have an effect on the prey that they inject with that. So it essentially begins to digest the organism before you ingest it, and that's going to mean that you're using a lot less energy to digest the animal. Yeah.
What happens if a snake has a cut in its mouth and then it tries to bite something and then its venom gets in its bloodstream?
I don't know. You should research that and get back with it. Yeah, I think they're generally immune to that.
I feel like
So,
that's baloney.
so if I just took like a little bit of snake venom every day, could I live up to
Well, that's you have to inject it.
Technically, yes.
You should try that. Try it.
just a little bit every day?
Yeah, just a little. I mean, not too much, because too much. will go back.
Rattlesnakes would fear me.
I'm sure that injecting
It
venom is
seems
the
like
same
you
as
guys have a
pre-allergic
lot of
reaction.
questions about venom, so I would encourage you to Google it.
I did Google the.
Okay, moving on to something. Okay, so there's a variety of different venom injecting or delivery systems, right? So the different ways that animals can get venom into their prey, but they all have the same basic components, right? You've got some type of gland that produces the venom. The venoms are different depending on the organism. You have muscles associated with the gland, of course, that contract and put pressure on the gland to push the venom out. There has to be some type of duct that connects the venom gland to the delivery mechanism, which is the tooth, right? And then you also typically have some type of tooth that's modified, not always, but mostly there's some type of tooth that is different morphologically than the other teeth that allow the venom to be delivered effectively into the prey item. So different forms of that could be like an open groove on the tooth, on the front, usually on the front surface of the tooth, just a groove for the venom to move down as the fang penetrates the prey. It could be a closed canal, like a hypodermic needle kind of delivery system. The fangs that are used could be fixed, which means they're not movable. Or you can have fangs that are retractable, movable, like in a cottonmouth or a rattlesnake. They have the fangs that kind of rest on the roof of the mouth, and then when they deliver, the fangs swing out and are used to inject venom. So those are some variations that we see in the teeth. The position of the fangs is different depending on the organism, so and whether they're modified or not. So aglyphous just means they're using a tooth that's not any different than the other teeth. So an unmodified tooth, which is typical of things like garter snakes, particularly for us, the harmless live bearers. Opistoglyphus are the rear fang snakes, and so for us that would be mud snake, hognose snake, and then the ringneck snake. So they have teeth that are slightly different than the other teeth but they're in the back of the jaw. So that's why we're called rear fangs. And then you've got proteroglyphus, which are fangs at the front and permanently erect. And then the last kind is selenoglyphus, which is our teeth that are hollow but can fold up on the roof of the mouth. And this is just an example. So this is aglyphus. So this just means the teeth that are used to deliver the venom, probably these ones, but they look like all the others. But the gland is associated with those teeth, and the venom will travel down that particular tooth. This is a rear fang snake, so kind of hard to see, but the venom delivery teeth are back here, and this is the front of the jaw, and so not at the front like the cottonmouth and copperheads. This is a proteroglyphus, so at the front of this is a cobra, and at the front of the jaw is this tooth, but it's fixed, and they usually have some type of groove or slot on the lower jaw that accommodates that tooth. And then this is the selenoglyphus, and so hollow, but also move back and forth depending on what they're doing, and that's what a copperhead or a cottonmouth would look like. Okay, and so generally speaking, with these animals, the venom is always present in some form, and they'll store it until they need it, and for the most part, they don't use it unless they are ingesting prey, or a lot of times, obviously, in defense. But most of the time, these animals are reluctant to use their venom because it is expensive to make. The dose might be regulated, which makes sense, right? Why would you expect the dose to be regulated?
They don't use too much, more than they need.
Yeah, so if they're attacking a small prey, they might use less of it, and because again, it's expensive to make, so these guys are not going to be using it unless they need it. If it's a larger prey, they'll do that. I guess common, I don't know if it's really a misconception or not, but a lot of folks consider small venomous snakes more dangerous than large ones because they're not able to do that as well, which is probably true, but a small snake always is going to have less venom than a big snake. So generally, the bigger the snake, the more venom that is there. May not deliver all of it, may deliver none of it, but if they do deliver it, it could be a large dose, and that's going to be a lot more dangerous than a small dose. Okay, I'm going to stop here. We'll finish that. Okay, anybody?